Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our event, 400 Years of Inequity and the Impact on Today's Public Health. I'm Nicole Burnside, our school's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager, and I wanted to start off by setting the stage. This October marks 400 years since the first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia in 1619. A movement called 400 Years of Inequality is taking place across the country to highlight and acknowledge the ways in which slavery has created lasting inequalities in our society. Here at the School of Public Health, it is our responsibility and our honor to be a part of this movement. And at today's event, we look specifically at how slavery and its legacy have shaped public health in Black communities. We are lucky to have our three distinguished panelists and an excellent moderator with us. While our conversation today will focus on the experiences of Black communities in America, it is also important for us to acknowledge Native inhabitants of our land and their experiences. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the treaty at the foot of the rapids so that children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to this university are renewed and reaffirmed. Now to kick off our programming, I would like to introduce our Dean, Dean Du Bois Bowman.
How's everyone doing? All right, thank you, Nicole, and welcome to everyone and to the panelists. Thanks for joining us. Certainly look forward to hearing your remarks later in the program in just a few minutes. So first, I'd like to start out just by stating that diversity, equity, and inclusion are really central to who we are as a school. As a school, we're our strongest when we have faculty, staff, students from diverse backgrounds, experiences, values, and perspectives. It's essentially what drives excellence. But being in the field of public health, DEI and the importance and significance of DEI go well beyond these two buildings. At the core of what we do, we strive to create a healthier, more equitable world for all, with emphasis on all. And we know that there often are deep inequalities when it comes to the health and well-being of different communities. And the 400 years of inequality movement and this event today provide us with an important opportunity to pause and reflect on how slavery and racism have impacted African American communities. And not simply from a historical perspective, but also because those impacts are still being felt today. As one classic example, infant mortality. In the United States, infant mortality rates for African Americans are more than twice what they are for other ethnic and racial groups, except for Native Americans. This gap is not new. In fact, it's persisted for more than 100 years, effectively since good, sound record keeping were available. Long after slavery ended, law and policy continued to be crafted and implemented in ways that restricted African Americans from accessing public health services, stable and safe housing, and basic social services. And the public health systems that are supposed to support and protect all of us have not always done so for all of us. I've spoken a couple of times to our School of Public Health community about my mentor, the late Dr. Bill Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins was an epidemiologist and a biostatistician who dedicated his career to recruiting students of color into public health professions. When I was in undergrad, it was a conversation with Dr. Jenkins that opened my eyes to the field of biostatistics and later inspired me to pursue public health. The reasons why Dr. Jenkins was so dedicated to mentoring and fostering students like myself were, well, for one, by the time he received his doctorate in public health, there were only 3 other African Americans in the country that held that credential. But secondly, because of an experience that he had that deeply impacted him early in his career. Working as a young statistician at the United States Public Health Service in the 1960s, Bill learned about the Tuskegee study, during which, as many of you know, the government studied the unabated progression of syphilis in black men without their consent. Participants were told they had bad blood. They were not told that they had syphilis. Participants were not given medication, even though medication was readily available. I know that one of our panelists, Dr. Howell, will be talking more in more detail about this in just a bit. But after learning about the study, Bill, going back to my mentor, wrote to several reporters to try to expose this injustice. But the story was not picked up by the media. Eventually, a colleague, another health service epidemiologist, was able to work with the Associated Press to expose the study. And then later, it was halted, but only after 40 years of being active. After the study was made public, Bill fought to ensure that the participants and their families, which were also directly impacted, received the medical attention that they deserved. And he went on to then dedicate himself to reducing disease and illness and health inequalities among African Americans and people of color, in part by being a dedicated mentor. I should also say that he was one of those who advocated and ultimately got an apology from the federal government by then President Bill Clinton. As you'll hear from our panelists today, there continues to be deep disparities in our country when it comes to the health in the African American community. And if we're going to move forward to address and rectify the situation, we must reflect and understand the past and vigorously address root causes. So I thank you all for being here, a part of this important conversation. I'm glad we can be a host for convening here in the School of Public Health. I'd like to thank Nicole, the school-wide DEI committee, the department DEI committees for your work and partnership in pulling this event together. And I'd also like to thank the panelists for joining us. Now I'd like to call up Deb Watkins, Research Assistant Professor in Environmental Health Sciences, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you, Dean Bowman. I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists for today's event, and we are super excited that they could be here with us today to share their work. First, we have Joel Howell, a professor here at the School of Public Health and Health Management and Policy. He's also a professor of internal medicine at the medical school and a professor of history at LSA. Dr. Howell has researched the history of medical experimentation on Black individuals. As you heard, he's written about the Tuskegee study as well as J. Marion Sims, who experimented on enslaved women. Next, we have Ebony Taylor, Deputy Director of Mothering Justice, which is a Black women-led nonprofit organization here in Michigan that empowers mothers of color to advocate and influence policy. Mothering Justice engages mothers and policymakers around a number of issues, including paid sick time for all workers, affordable child care, infant and maternal mortality, and maternal incarceration. Finally, we have Holly Hartman. Holly is a doctoral student here in School of Public Health in the Biostatistics Department. Holly co-led a study that examined why prostate cancer mortality is higher among Black men. Her thesis work is on designing clinical trials to more effectively represent how clinicians prescribe medication for rare diseases. So thank you all for being with us here today. To begin, each of our panelists will give a short presentation to introduce their work and highlight how historical inequalities have created health disparities in their respective disciplines. After that, we will have a moderated discussion with some time at the end for questions for the audience. So I know for those here in the room, you received a note card and pen when you walked in. As you listen to our panelists' presentations, please write down any questions that come to mind about their research and our topic today. For those of you watching through our live stream, we want to hear from you too. Please submit your questions to sph.events@umich.edu. And we will collect the note cards and the emailed questions right before our moderated discussion begins. So we will try to get through as many as we can. So now we will begin with the presentations. We will begin with Dr. Howell.
Okay, let's see if we can get this working. I am not seeing my presentation. This man was a subject in the experiments done in and around Tuskegee, Alabama from 1932 to 1972. I wish I could tell you his name, tell you something about him. Unfortunately, I cannot. I do know that he was a descendant of one of the many African Americans who were enslaved in the U.S. South before the Civil War. This is a rather brutal and unsettling picture, but it's meant to emphasize the role that the medical profession played in the institution of slavery. They played a critical role in the economics of the system, as you see here, in assessing the monetary value of a human being, an enslaved person. As many of you know, the importation of slaves was cut off in 1808, but the South's cotton-based economy continued to expand. Plantation owners needed more enslaved people to work the fields, thus the increased importance of childbearing. There was pressure for people to have children, often far too young, which led to terrible complications of childbearing, such as vesicovaginal fistula. Vesicovaginal fistula is a hole between the vagina and the rectum. The horrible consequences of this lesion that is caused by prolonged childbirth, prolonged labor, and particularly in young women, is described here by physician J. Marion Sims. Now, because it affected women and affected their ability to have children, it was of considerable economic importance to slave owners. And J. Marion Sims set out to find a cure. This is the hospital in which he experimented on women from 1846 to 1849. 30 women were kept in this hospital. I wish I could tell you their names or something about them. We have 3 names only: Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha. They were operated on over and over and over again, some of them as many as 30 times. Obviously without anesthesia, obviously without antisepsis, and most obviously without consent. This is the paper that Sims wrote describing the cure that he discovered. He moved north and he opened the first hospital for women in the United States. Despite the sordid nature of these experiments, J. Marion Sims went on to a career of great fame and fortune. He was the president of many important institutions, including the American Medical Association. He was hailed, and still is hailed in some circles, as the father of gynecology, and he was the first physician in the United States to have a statue erected in his honor. This statue was on the Upper East Side of New York City. We're going to come back to it. The Civil War brought the end of slavery, but it did not bring the end of racism or of racialized experiments, as Dean Bowman alluded to in his introductory remarks. We're going to stay in South Alabama, and go not far from where Sims did his research to the small town of Tuskegee, Alabama. Tuskegee in 1932 was still dominated by the cotton industry and by sharecropping. And it was in that setting that the Public Health Service set up a study to determine the natural history of untreated syphilis in 400 African American men. They wanted to study what happened to them during life and then to study autopsy findings that resulted. In the years that followed, Public Health Service physicians came down to examine the men on a regular basis. They drew blood, as you see here, and also did lumbar punctures. Despite the fact that as members of the Public Health Service, they were the people charged with preserving the health of the people in this country, they lied to the men and they prevented them from getting what treatment existed in the 1930s. The therapeutic landscape changed dramatically with the advent of the widespread availability of penicillin. And you might have thought that ready access to an effective cure would have led the Public Health Service to stop the experiment and treat the men. No, the experiment went on. What about ethics codes? After the Second World War, highly publicized trials of leading German doctors for atrocities in the Holocaust led to ethics codes such as the Nuremberg Code, which states, inter alia, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. These ethics codes were written by people in the United States, but seem not to apply to the Tuskegee experiments, which went on apace. You may be thinking, surely these experiments would have ended whenever anybody knew what was going on. Well, look at this paper. The title, Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro, hardly obscure or hard to understand. Where was it presented? The annual meeting of the American Medical Association. You can't think of a much higher profile place to present the results. And look at the authors, all senior public health officials. No, my friends, this experiment was never a secret. The results were published in major medical journals that went all around the United States to libraries and physicians, such as this one. Again, the study of untreated syphilis, in which they discovered that the effects of not treating a treatable disease, previously thought to be a decrease in life expectancy of 17%, were actually more like a decrease in life expectancy of 20%. That's what these men were proving with their lives. The civil rights movement, not something that one slept through. Here's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Washington, D.C. You would have thought with the civil rights movement, with everybody knowing about the experiments, that somebody in the Public Health Service, somebody would have said, well, what's going on down in Alabama? We ought to do something about this. It didn't stop then. The experiments finally ended in 1972. Again, Dean Bowman mentioned this when the Associated Press finally picked up the story. This is one of many cartoons and editorial comments that appeared at the time. The Public Health Service, in their report, agreed that the men had been lied to, but insisted with a straight face that there was absolutely nothing racial about the experiments. Yes, that's the appropriate reaction. President Clinton, in 1997, apologized in strikingly strong language for a president of the United States. He said, and I quote, "What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry." Most of the men at that point were either dead or too ill to come up to Washington, D.C. One was not. Herman Shaw, depicted in this picture, made the trip up to D.C. and heard the apology. What are the implications for today? Mistrust of the healthcare system is a big one. This is a poll done by the New York Times showing that about a third of black Americans think it's true or possibly true that AIDS was deliberately created in a laboratory to infect black people. I don't think that's true. But I think if you know what happened at Tuskegee, it's not hard to see how somebody would believe that that could be true. Here's another bit of research in the National Bureau of Economic Research, estimating that after the experiments were widely publicized in 1972, African American men were less likely to seek medical care, presumably due to a distrust of the healthcare system. They estimated a 1.4-year decrease in life expectancy. That's about a third of the black-white discrepancy at that point. Today, the Sims statue has been moved away from its position on Central Park. There is an Institute for Ethics at the Tuskegee Institute. We now have a national system of IRBs that came out of the Tuskegee experiments. But as the noted historian Vanessa Gamble asks, what's Tuskegee got to do with it? The problems have not gone away. We need to see Sims and Tuskegee not as the cause, but as symptoms of the underlying problem. We need to learn from what happened from the gentleman whose picture was up there a second ago and many others as we attempt to combat structural racism in today's healthcare system. Thank you.
It is so great to be back here at the University of Michigan. I went here as an undergrad, and I'm also an alum of the Ford School. And so it's really great to be back here and to talk about this very important topic. So thank you for having me. Okay, let's see how this goes. The 20 seconds per slide. Okay. On the left-hand side, are child's iron shackles. On the right-hand side is an iron ballast block used to counterbalance the weight of enslaved Africans. This is a Virginia law in 1662 stating that the race of the child followed the race of the mother, meaning enslaved black women gave birth to generations of children of African descent who are now seen as commodities. We cannot talk about black maternal health without discussing capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Capitalism started with slavery. Right before the Civil War, the Mississippi Valley had more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the U.S. Cotton grown and picked by slaves was the nation's most valuable export. White supremacy, coupled with white ownership of black bodies, is one of the bases in the struggle for black maternal health and motherhood. Today it includes daily resistance against anti-black racism, violence, and institutional and systemic barriers to basic needs. The patriarchy was very present in the relationship between male slaveholders and enslaved women, most evidently in the rape of black women and forced gynecological experimentation, which we heard some of already. We see patriarchal attacks today with male-led legislatures governing black female bodies and all female bodies around reproductive health. When Congress ended participation in the international slave trade, the only way of increasing slave labor was through new births. If enslaved mothers did not bear sufficient numbers of children to sell, trade, and take the place of aged and dying workers, the South could not continue as a slave society. The expectation increased among members of the owning class that is enslaved women would contribute to the economic success of the plantation, not only through productive labor, but also through procreation. This had impacts on the way owners thought about the future of slavery and the way doctors practiced medicine. Wet nursing was the exploitation of enslaved women at the intersection of labor and reproduction. Enforced wet nursing was a distinct aspect of enslaved women's commodification. White women used this as a tool to manipulate black motherhood for slaveholders' benefit. In the book, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, the author explains punishment for black pregnant slaves, which included them lying face down with their pregnant bellies inside of a hole and being whipped. For black women, not even childbearing could serve as a reprieve from physical punishment. In the United States, black pregnant women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from labor and delivery complications compared to their white counterparts. These numbers are not too far off from the rate that black mothers died during slavery, which is obviously very telling that we're today in 2019, not too far from these numbers. Excuse me. The involvement of doctors with enslaved women's reproductive health represented an expansion of the slaveholders' domain. Black women struggled to assert their own customs. Rather than acquiescing, Black women attempted to regulate birth to accord with their own notions of timing and frequency of motherhood, which was essentially the only power, if you want to call that power, it was the only power that they had. According to a ProPublica and NPR survey of over 200 Black mothers, the feeling of being devalued and disrespected by medical providers was a constant theme. Over and over, Black women shared that medical providers equated being African American with poor, uneducated, non-compliant, and unworthy. But we obviously are very worthy. Mothering Justice, through our focus groups on Black maternal health experiences, found that more than 50% of participants felt ignored and invisible during prenatal care leading up to delivery and postpartum, which is consistent with numerous studies that show pain is often undertreated in Black patients. In September 2017, professional tennis player Serena Williams' maternal health crisis demonstrated that Black women's reproductive health can be jeopardized, suspect, dismissed, and at risk of demise, even for the very talented, wealthy, and well-known. So we can only imagine how it is for an average Black woman expecting. Only recently has the news media given greater attention to the U.S. maternal health crisis, spurring awareness and actions by lawmakers and health professionals. In 2017, ProPublica and NPR launched Lost Mothers, and thereafter coverage from New York Times, CNN, and other major outlets emerged. Black Mamas Matter Alliance is a Black woman-led cross-sectoral alliance that centers Black mamas to advocate, drive research, build power, and shift culture for Black maternal health rights and justice. BMMA envisions a world where Black mamas have the rights, respect, and resources to thrive before, during, and after pregnancy. One of the most fundamental problems underlying the maternal mortality crisis in the U.S. is the shortage of reliable data around what kills American mothers. So in 2017, the House approved H.R. 1318, Preventing Maternal Deaths Act. And in 2018, Senator Harris and Booker took it a step further with bills around disparities. In April of 2019, Congresswoman Underwood and Adams launched the Black Maternal Health Caucus to improve Black maternal health outcomes. The Black Maternal Health Caucus wants to establish Black maternal health as a national priority and explore and advocate for effective evidence-based solutions for Black mothers. At Mothering Justice, our Mama's agenda includes issues that Black mothers want solutions around, including the prioritization of Black maternal health. One of the solutions that our mamas want to see is an increase in state funding for home visiting nursing programs. The history of violence and neglect, criminalization, housing and environmental security, the daily stress of racism, which I'm sure you've all heard of as being called weathering, and the long-time devaluation of Black motherhood in American society are all but a few of the causes that have brought us here. And I believe changes in Washington, D.C., hence the picture, can help set the pace for recovery. And if I can just say lastly, I would like to acknowledge previously unstated data and excerpts from the Center for American Progress, New York Times, Self Magazine, PBS, and Birthing a Slave, Motherhood and Medicine in the Antebellum South. Thank you very much.
There are racial inequalities in almost all types of cancer, where Black people have worse outcomes than white people. Prostate cancer is one such type of cancer where there's an extreme difference in prostate cancer mortality between Black men and white men. At the population level, black men have an estimated 30% increased hazard of dying of their prostate cancer than of white men. This is an area with ongoing research. In order to address this disparity in prostate cancer, we must first answer why there is an inequality so that we can address the root problem. Is this due to socioeconomic status? Is this due to unconscious or conscious racism in the healthcare field? Is it due to biological differences in the tumor types? Racial inequalities can be a difficult subject to study, both in the context of understanding the nuances of this very delicate topic, but also statistically. We have to rely on observational data, and observational data has a lot of confounders in it. But what exactly are confounders? We're going to talk through an example. Let's say that we want to know the difference between surgery and radiation, and we want to know which one is a better treatment. However, mostly healthier people receive surgery because it's a very physically stressful event, and doctors don't want to take the risk with less healthy patients. Then this induces bias. Surgery might look like it does better just because the patients receiving that treatment are already healthier to start. If we don't account for this, then we might come to the wrong conclusion. The same could be true with race. White men might have better access to care, be more likely to be insured, or even have general better health before being diagnosed with prostate cancer. And all of those things could lead to the better outcomes that white men have. If we don't account for these differences, then we might come to the wrong conclusion and then spend time and resources addressing that wrong conclusion. Fortunately, there are statistical methods that we can use that help adjust for this. One common method that's used in observational data is called propensity weighting, where the covariates like insurance status or the stage of the disease are balanced between two groups by weighting people in the study differently based on their own covariates. The end result is two groups that should be comparable. So if in our original data set, black men have more severe disease than white men, after the weighting, the severity of the disease should be equivalent, and we should be able to get an unbiased estimate of the effect of race on prostate cancer mortality. However, this propensity weighting method does come with assumptions, and I'll talk about those a little bit later as well. So we used this propensity weighting method in a large national population cancer registry database called SEER. We were able to adjust for variables like the stage of the disease and the severity of the disease, as well as some socioeconomic variables. We found that black men have worse outcomes than white men in prostate cancer and are more likely to die of their disease, even after adjusting for all these variables. Other researchers have also taken a look at this prostate cancer mortality difference in observational data sets and have come to the conclusion that this difference is driven by a biological difference in the tumors, not necessarily anything related to socioeconomic status or treatments received or access to care. This is an area there's research happening right now to try to understand what those biological differences might be. Epidemiologists, cancer biologists, and clinicians are all trying to understand what this, why there is this difference in prostate cancer mortality under the assumption that it is not based in socioeconomic status, but a biological difference. There is time, money, and resources being trying to identify this biological mechanism that's driving cancer mortality. However, one of the really big assumptions in propensity weighting and many other methods for observational data is that there's no unmeasured confounders. This means that anything that's related to race and might be different between black men and white men, that's also related to prostate cancer outcomes, has been measured and accurately and correctly included in the model. But this is absolutely not realistic. There are some things that we just can't measure, like distrust of medical professionals or chronic stress from unstable housing. Additionally, these observational data sets quite simply don't have a lot of data about the patients. Most don't include comorbidities or other diseases that the patients have. To address this, myself and my collaborators at the University Hospital took a slightly different approach to this problem. We looked at data from a randomized clinical trial. The randomized trials that we used enrolled approximately 20% black men, And enrolling black patients in clinical trials actually isn't as common as you might hope it would be, but that's a whole nother issue. While the patients in these trials received different treatments, they all had equal access to care and received equal quality care while in the study. Randomized trials also have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. So all the men in these studies are fairly similar to start with. We were able to adjust for the cancer severity, age, stage of the disease, and the treatments that they received using that same propensity weighting method. We found no difference in prostate cancer specific mortality between black men and white men. If this was a biological difference, we would expect to see black men having worse outcomes even in this very controlled setting because we didn't account for any underlying biology. We then also looked at some data from the VA. In the VA data set, theoretically, all men should have equal access to care, although they might not receive the same care once they're in the system. Additionally, the VA population is much more heterogeneous than the randomized control trial because there's no inclusion or exclusion criteria here. We found the same thing. Black men and white men had no difference in prostate cancer specific mortality. So what does this mean? This data strongly suggests that there is not a biological mechanism that is driving this increased prostate cancer mortality among black men. If there was a biological mechanism, then we would expect black men to have worse outcomes in the VA data set and in the randomized control trial data set. But that's not what we saw. This research highlights how important it is to really understand the assumptions of the methods that we're using, especially when we're looking at racial differences. The critical point here is that some of these methods have assumptions that we just cannot meet, no matter how dedicated the researcher is or how clean the data might be. Unfortunately, we just can't measure some things, and we have to use methods that account for this. This has resulted in research focusing on a potentially incorrect solution to the problem. The research being done that's focusing on identifying the biological difference between black men and white men's prostate cancer that's driving an increase in mortality might not actually be necessary if the true underlying cause is socioeconomic status or institutional racism. The time we spend chasing the wrong solution can be deadly. This research suggests that the problem that's causing this increased mortality among black men is actually systemic. The difference in outcomes is related to access to care, socioeconomic status, and other immeasurable factors. This means that we have a lot of work to do addressing institutional racism in healthcare. And the longer we wait to spend addressing this, the more black men will die of their prostate cancer. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for 3 really informative presentations. If any of you have questions, please hold up your note card and someone will come around to collect it from you. And for those, again, watching live, you can submit questions digitally by emailing sph.events@umich.edu. Okay. So now I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Truman Hudson, Jr. Dr. Hudson is a social economist who has 29 years of experience in developing, implementing, researching, and evaluating educational and community economic development projects. He has a focus on investigating systems that influence black men's health. He serves as the contract manager and health link specialist for a project at Wayne State University and the Carmanos Cancer Institute that seeks to better engage black men in patient-centered outcomes research related to cancer. He has served as a lecturer at the University of Michigan Dearborn, Wayne State University, Central Michigan University, Madonna University, and the Wayne County Community College District. Dr. Hudson, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. As stated, this subject is near and dear to my heart in a lot of ways because I'm a black man. But also in the 1990s, I saw a lot of my fraternity brothers and black men dying at high rates because of prostate cancer. And what I do recall is there were screening protocols put into place at one time. And now the screening protocols have been removed. So no longer are we looking at trying to monitor and determine how we get ahead of the game. Holly, question. When we look at engaging black men in research as leaders and partners around cancer research, what do you think are some of the best strategies to help address issues around screening protocols that your physicians say that you don't need, but when you go as a black man and you say, hey, doc, I need to be checked because my father had prostate cancer, my grandfather had prostate cancer, and I think there's something there.
Yeah, so the screening protocols of prostate cancer are pretty interesting, how they've changed over time. There's actually some research happening right now at the University of Michigan Hospital regarding who exactly should be screened and what the protocol should be, because right now older men aren't screened even though they have more severe prostate cancer. So I think what's important when we're visiting screening protocols is to really examine the data that we're using. I mean, as I showed in the presentation, is that observational data, there's a lot of things that we can't adjust for. So using some sort of randomized trial is really important when looking at screening protocols. And then in addition to that, making sure that the randomized trials actually include and actively recruit a diverse population, including black men. So I think that it's really important to look at the data that we're using and the population that we're looking at. Thank you.
Joe, I have a question for you. You referenced to structural racism and how structural racism kind of influences healthcare decisions as well as the delivery of service. What are some strategies that we can take as individuals in this room to address structural racism? Because I think Ebony referenced to the government as one vehicle that we can use to address structural racism. What are, based on your professional experience, what can we do?
Well, people in this room are all part of an educational system at one level or another. And I think that what we can do is make sure that as part of our education for everybody that comes through, we appreciate not only the implications of structural racism, but its causes. And you identified yourself, you're an African-American man, I'm a white man. And as such, throughout my career, I mean, I've been a white man my entire life. Yeah, ever since I was born. You know, I'd like to think that what I've accomplished on the basis of hard work and being smart and being lucky. But I've also had advantages all along the way. I grew up in a small town in Columbus, Mississippi. Anybody ever heard of Columbus, Mississippi? Yes, it's 12,000 people, northeast Mississippi. It's the site where DeSoto crossed the Tombigbee. Now you know pretty much. And Eudora Weldy was born. There's not a whole lot to know about Columbus. But, you know, in the 1960s, that was certainly a poster child for white privilege and aggressive racism. And it's always stuck with me. And I was fortunate enough to have parents who made me aware of that. And so I think being for all of us, being aware is terribly important. Black people, white people, brown people, anybody.
And I would just add on to that and say that yes, it is super important for the burden to not just be on people of color to have have conversations around these issues. At Mothering Justice, we have a fellowship program called White Women's School. And it's a 9-month program. It's actually an international fellowship. We have women from Australia, Canada, across the United States. And it's all about teaching, talking about these historical impacts that land us where we are today. We talk about how white women and white people can show up around these issues in true allyship. So, I mean, when we talk about solutions, the burden can't just be, and the onus can't just be on us to bear that conversation.
Cool. So while we're talking about bearing the conversation around inequities, mortality rate, Ebony, when we look at infant mortality in the black community, you brought out some alarming statistics. As public health professionals, training to get into the public health profession, what advice would you give to our young scholars here? What can they do to help address the mortality issues around publication, around dissemination, as well as practice?
I would say, and I think you meant maternal mortality. Maternal mortality. So I would say to get into as many diversity classes as possible. We have Mother and Justice has actually engaged. Actually, U of M reached out to us. U of M's OB department reached out to us to see how they can better teach medical students around implicit bias and have what do you call the classes that are outside of your requirement classes? Electives, right. It's been a while. I said that. So yeah, just getting into as many classes as you can, making sure that your data is diverse. There's an organization called Data for Black Lives, and their whole thing is like around, not using the same traditional methodologies to acquire data. So I think like a variety of data, making sure that is not biased, and taking classes that will I think that we all are impacted. We have our biases, right? So how do you take individual responsibility to get rid of those, or at least to reduce them?
Yeah, and I would also add, thinking about the structure of structural racism and the fact that healthcare is only part of the solution. This is a conversation I had this morning over in the hospital. If you really want to make a difference, one of the things we need to do is to improve the economic conditions and reduce income disparities, which is a big part of the health problem. And I guess one piece of advice I would give is for people to be politically active and politically engaged. In whatever way you think is most likely to result in an improvement in reductions in income disparity and in reductions of poverty. And that's going to have a huge healthcare impact.
So if we build off the conversation around politics and politically correct, we have a question from the audience in regards to please define black as compared to descendants of enslaved Africans, as well as U.S. African-born citizens, internationally born blacks. So who has something on that? Because I think that's important, because language is changing. We're at a space now where we're using our preferred gender pronoun. So as an academician, I know I'm constantly adjusting to language. But I think when Dean and I went to school, we were African American, Afro-American, Negro, colored. Language changes. So can we talk about the difference? So please define black in comparison compared to descendants of enslaved Africans, and then it says U.S. African-born black. Yes. No. Come.
Right. So in the data that I was talking about, all the participants were self-identified. So it was just a little survey that they filled out and identified their race. And we only included people that self-identified as black, which does include, people who might be actually from Africa, and it might also include some black Hispanic people. But we also, for the population registry database, we limited it to black non-Hispanic. There is some research that has been done about some of the differences between African Americans or Africans who then come to America. And it's interesting because it very quickly becomes very similar. Unfortunately, there's a lot of just stress in this environment for people who are black, regardless of where they were born. And so it becomes very similar very quickly, but we didn't look at that specifically in this research topic. That would be an interesting expansion as well. Thank you. Anybody else want to talk about that? Okay.
But I think it's still important to still pick up, because even in reading the card and hearing the card and the question aren't connected. How do we define black when it comes to this research?
As a historian, and I'm looking historically, I mean, one of the big messages is, and this isn't hot news to anybody in this room, is that race is to a large extent a social construct. And so for the people that I'm looking at people that are discriminated against because they are looked at and seen as black. And I don't think that discrimination generally differentiates between where they came from or, you know, what their actual genetic roots are.
That's a super loaded question. I really don't. I don't have a silver bullet answer to that. I would just echo what my fellow panelists have said, in that you know, we're the weathering issue. I kind of touched on it in my presentation, and I believe a professor here at the School of Public Health coined it. But the chronic stress that people of color, black people in particularly, experience, I don't know that it differs much by whether, you know, I'm a descendant of a slave that was brought here 400 years ago, or if I came here and was born in, I don't know, Jamaica, and I came, or in an African country and came here as a child or as a teenager. I think that, you know, there's that experience of just being in America and experiencing chronic racism and barriers to just living your life. So.
You want to say something? I feel like I already answered that. All right. This question is near and dear to some research. Yes.
No, I think to provide some context, we come Arlington on this, right?
Yes.
So, like, as far as the art work that I've read, I think that I've read, like, the separation of, like, black Americans, that I call them first, like, second generation African Americans. There's some research that talks about how, like, in the initial stages, there's, like, birth outcome and things that are different, but then over time, as first and second generation immigrants stay in the United States, their health outcomes kind of worse. So in regards to, like, infant mortality, things like that.
Mm. Mm. All right. Yes, ma'am.
I think this question brings up an important, what is the subject of research on black maternal and infant mortality? So if we understand, right, that race and ethnicity and diasporic blacks are still coming to in an experiential language the same site and experiencing, despite of origin, the same outcomes in one case, I think to juxtapose white maternal infant mortality rate actually poses a really important theoretical question, which is how is it that that motherhood is not impacted, right? So just the sort of deficit model, I think we would be benefited by this reframing of centering race and ethnic blacks in research here on mortality, because for whatever reasons others are experiencing over time the same outcome, white maternal sort of Yeah, so I think it's a question of like what actually is going on and how this question could really advance research on what's happening in the
I appreciate your perspective on asset. Yeah, but I appreciate your perspective on asset framing the discussion. Because in our current research study that we're looking at how to engage black men in cancer research, which is a question that someone else posed, black men are already engaged. It's just how do we define engagement and how do we define this question again, how do we define black? Because there are people that define themselves quite differently. And what we found is on a national level, there's an organization called Be Me Community, where they had 180 black men across the country who were addressing issues from public health, social determinant towards health, as well as economic development. And they were making major impacts and strides, and they were not being lifted up in a lot of the formal research and published studies. So we only have 1 minute left because we're closing out, and I see she's giving me the look. Questions from the audience? Are there any other questions? Yes. Hi, come forward. What's that? Oh, another pile.
Another loaded. So I would love to see that. I would honestly be shocked to see that. Let me start there, because just as I mentioned before starting my presentation, I was here as an undergraduate student and as a grad student, and even trying to repair and fix the current situation, like the lack of diversity at Michigan, like currently present day, and their I guess they would call them efforts, but so I would be shocked and very surprised if they started to evaluate and look back and think through how this university has been impacted economically and otherwise by slave labor or in any way by, like I said, slave labor, and so I don't know. I don't know. I'd be happy to see it.
I would be shocked if a serious investigation, historical study didn't find ways in which it was impacted, since it's not an experience that was limited to the American South. It's modulated differently in different places, and one of the lessons of history is that things change. And so looking back, we can appreciate where we were. We're going to be different in 10 years or 20 years. Guarantee it. I don't know exactly how. And I think there is a liberating feature in looking at the past and realizing that things were different in the past, which means that things can be very different in the future. And it gives us hope that we can get somewhere.
I was meaning, like, just for clarity, that I would be shocked if they started that process. Not okay.
I understand. I'm just saying it. All right. I'm just saying it. Obviously, it would be extremely shocking to find that there was somehow a bubble around Ann Arbor, that all of the pernicious issues that affected the rest of the world somehow didn't come in. That would be surprising.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with all the other panelists up here. I mean, I think that would be a really amazing project and undertaking for the university to start. I mean, I think even just starting small and looking at the history of the School of Public Health or, even department-wise would be really interesting. And I think that it would also help inform, like, future movements that we should do, future efforts that we should put forth. So I think it would be really interesting. I haven't seen anything like that happening. But I'm a student here, so I don't see everything that's happening at a higher level. But I haven't seen anything like that.
Well, that was a good setup for the next question because it's about engaging community. It reads, recently the Center for American Progression called for midwives as the solution to black maternal mortality. What are your thoughts about that, and what school-based interdisciplinary projects do you think could happen in the school setting? So how do we leverage schools to help move this conversation?
So as I mentioned, and I will give, U of M did reach out to Mother and Justice to see how they can better prepare, students to deal with, different communities, particularly black communities. And so I think, actually being proactive and reaching out to organizations that are doing the work to help inform their students, to help inform their policies. I would love to see like the U of M's medical school to say, you know what, it's going to be a requirement for students to take classes on bias training, or take some sort of bias training. It's going to be a requirement to have a class around the historical context of black women during goodness gracious, black women's experience childbearing experiences. I think that our colleges and universities can be doing so much more, and not only has U of M reached out to us, but we've also reached out to other universities as well, Wayne State being one of them, since we are in Detroit specifically, just to see how we can continue the conversation and continue engaging, our future leaders and our future medical providers and care providers. So,
just as a brief point of information, in fact, in the medical school, all the medicals, this isn't nirvana, it doesn't make things perfect, but we have a session for all the medical students that's required to talk about the Tuskegee experiments, where we spend an hour presenting, and another hour in small groups unpacking some of the many issues, and there are many, many issues we didn't have time to get into today. So there is something, even if there's not enough.
that's good, yeah.
And the fact that they reached out to you, I think, is tremendous.
Yeah, that's a start.
So we'd like to thank Dr. Hudson, Dr. Howell, Ms. Hartman, Ms. Taylor for coming out with us today. Let's give everybody a hand. Appreciate the conversation. And this is just a beginning of the conversation, and it's nice to engage around our different thoughts, and to, as we uncover and we try to find ways to become more diverse, equitable, inclusive here at the University of Michigan at the School of Public Health. Each time we overturn one rock, it'll be another one for us to work on, because this is evolving. And as we are evolving and our learning is evolving, it's important for us to give each other this space around the conversation, around where we may have differences, and have that opportunity to have the conversation about it. So I thank you for taking the time to come out with us today and have this conversation. And as Dean Bowman said earlier, this is just one event of many that we have scheduled for around our school. And it's essential that we continue to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in fact, this semester, our diversity, equity, and inclusion committees have put together a series of workshops around the power of an inclusive community. And the power of that is also understanding our historical impacts. Each of us have a history. Each of us have a background that we bring through these doors each day. And how do we take that as public health professionals, faculty members, and staff members to help fuel us and propel us to create a healthier, more inclusive world? We hope that, including the semester theme, we're able to have a deeper, more sustained conversation that spans many months. We encourage you to take what you learned today and continue the conversation within our school, within your departments, outside of our school, because what we learned today is that it takes each of us to be a part of how we treat each other and also looking at these systems of inequality. Talk to your friends and family about what you learned today. Continue engaging with others around the topic of healthcare disparities. And it can be uncomfortable at times. These conversations are uncomfortable. But that's how we grow, and we need to make space for each other to grow. And it's important that we always and we continue to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is important that, just echo it one more time, that we hear each other, because sometimes these conversations can be a little isolating, but let's share the conversation and build from each other. I encourage you to attend one of our DEI events throughout the school. One we have coming up is on November 15th. It's called One Workplace, Many Experiences. In this workshop, participants will explore how individual coworkers can experience the same workplace in a widely varied ways. We will specifically explore how workplace power differentials and privilege associated with social identities come into play. I hope to see you there. I want to thank the members of our school-wide and our department-wide DEI committee. If any are here, I don't see many, but if any are here, can you just raise your hand, or previous members? And I would just want to thank them for coming up with this idea, helping us in the Marketing and Communications Committee think through the idea and the planning for today. And if you're interested in getting more involved, please connect to one of your DEI committee members within your department. And finally, I just want to thank you for attending today in person and on the stream. You could have been anywhere else today, but you chose to have this conversation with us, and we sincerely appreciate it. And I invite you to join us in the community room if you like for refreshments. Thank you.